And now, um, okay, can you see me?
It's coming. I can't. I have a black screen now. I can't see you.
Can you see me now? All right, let me see if I can share my.
Oh, there you are.
Hi! Oh, I'm here.
Hi.
Can anybody else see me? I finally figured it out. Okay. All right, now I'm going to pull up the slides. Can you see the slides now?
It's a delay.
So okay, it's a delay. All right, so let me see if I can present.
Yes, I can see the slide.
Yay! Okay, this is great. We're figuring it out. Okay, so let me just do the present. Present. Okay, great. Now, do you see my face and the slides?
I can see both right now.
You can?
Yes, I can see your face and I can see the slides.
Wonderful. Okay, now I can see both. Okay, welcome. Sorry for the delay. If anyone is okay, you're wait.
Now I see it.
You can see me now. Okay, thank you. Hey, Jess, can you just text me if you see any other problems since this is my first time doing this?
Not a problem. I can do that.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Hello and welcome, everyone. Sorry for the delay. My name is Stephanie Cook, and I am the Executive Director of Couples Counseling ATL. And this is our first ever webinar, part of a whole series that we're hoping to do free for the community. Still experiencing, obviously, some technical difficulties, but hopefully we can get those figured out. But today, I really wanted to start off with an important subject, considering that most of us are at home and that we are experiencing a pandemic. A lot of people are stressed, and understandably, and especially a lot of our couples are experiencing stress trying to manage childcare and unemployment and work, and just all kinds of fears, understandable fears around getting sick. And so I thought, what better way with all of our trained professional counselors who see couples all day, every day, to start providing some free information about what healthy relationships look like, and how we can help you to manage especially this very difficult time. So let's start off with today's presentation, which is about the masters in disasters and what we've learned from the Gottman Institute's research. Part of what we know, is really helpful. Thousands of couples have been studied over several decades by the Gottman Institute, and I'm just a big research nerd, among many other things, in addition to running the group counseling practice with 4 other full-time counselors. I'm also a certified Gottman couples therapist, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And I really love telling stories about how all of this research began, because I think it will really make most people fall in love with what works in the same way that it's made me fall in love with it. So just so you know, the overview for today, we're probably just going to spend about 30 minutes reviewing the research and the methods. And there will be basically a story about Dr. John Gottman, who founded Institute's research. He's a clinical, but mainly a research psychologist. So we're going to really concentrate on his story and how the research for the type of couples therapy that we use in our practice called the Gottman method, how it began, how it's evolved over the years, the different methods that were used to study couples, why we know what we know. And so we'll begin with a cute story about Dr. Gottman and how he was really a scientist who was pretty unlucky at love. And then we'll go over the decades of research and what that's looked like, the importance of physiology, especially in our research findings, and then what the masters and the disasters look like in terms of their behavior. If you are watching this live, please feel free to text in the chat feature if you have a particular question. I'll also have a question and answer at the end of this webinar, but most people will probably watch this recorded. So if you have any questions later, please feel free to email me at stephanie@counselingatl.com. So let's begin our story with the story of Dr. John Gottman and how all of our research that we have today came about. Sorry, I'm just checking my phone too to make sure that since this is my first time doing a recorded webinar that you can actually hear me and see me. And so if I look down, it's to check my notes or to check the phone to make sure that you can still hear or see me. So I'd like you to know that Dr. John Gottman was born in the 40s in the Dominican Republic to a former Orthodox rabbi from Europe who had moved there, in the midst of everything going on in World War II. And then he grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And as a boy, he showed a really strong acumen and love of math. And he became actually really brilliant at math. One thing that he talks about really struggling with, though, was love. And he actually described himself as a disaster at love. And he had been, just going from one bad relationship to another. So by the time he was studying psychology and research psychology at the University of Indiana, he was a graduate student and was having coffee with Bob Levinson there. You can see John Gottman on the right and Bob Levinson, one of his lifelong friends and colleagues, research partner. They were having coffee and both sharing woes about how love wasn't going anywhere for them. And they said, we've got to study this. This is what our research is going to be about. And it was really his own difficulty with love that inspired his desire to study what works, what makes a long-lasting relationship healthy, what makes some people who are even in love fall apart. It just seemed like something that no one had studied, and especially not scientifically. So he started, let me see if I get the slide going. Oops. So he started without really any theories. That's what's important to know, is that he was just kind of clueless and felt like, we've got to, we can't really study anything without first observing. That's kind of part of the scientific method. And really the only research that had been done on long relationships or marriage or anything like that was more in the field of sociology. And so they had done some good work on reliability and validity in terms of testing. But the best research, so to speak, was really just surveys that were conducted where people would answer them all by themselves. And whether or not you realize, most of the time that's not very, it only provides so much data, and it definitely doesn't give us any sort of answers as to what makes love last. So they knew with a big computer like this, this was their first, it was called the PDP-11, I believe. It was about the size, as you can see, of a whole entire room. It could do less than our smartphones can do today. But this was what they were using to simultaneously start observing couples using many different measures in real time. So instead of just a self-report, they wanted to look at couples interact, again, without any real theories. They really wanted to know what role, emotion played in relationships, especially, not just self-report of satisfaction or following couples to see when or if they divorced, but how can we really understand emotion and how people feel being in a relationship. And so they were the first to start by studying physiology. And what's really important about that is that they were starting to use harder science measures that don't lie, unlike a survey, such as heart rate, blood oxygen, skin conductance, And so what they would do is they would start to bring in couples. This was their first study ever, and this is what we've built most of the research upon, was a single study that was then replicated over and over again without any theories. They would just bring in couples and watch them, and what they asked them to do at first was to just discuss an area of difficulty. So imagine, I'm sure most of us today have lots of arguments and just areas of disagreement with our partners or our spouses, especially right now during times of stress. But they asked them to talk about their most stressful, most difficult argument or conflict that they, topic that they ever have. And they asked them to talk about it for, 10 to 15 minutes. And not only did they have them wear, heart monitors and, different physiological measures, they also had video cameras so that they could simultaneously watch the facial expressions of both people in the couple. And thankfully, there was this scientist at the time named Paul Ekman, who really helped us to understand that there are many different micro kind of movements that your face can make that are universal to culture, that we can actually code. And it's called the SPAF, or affect, kind of a way of coding different facial movements. And so they had video recordings, they had these physiological measures, and they had these couples first talk about areas of conflict, and then they had them talk about, something not related, something pleasant. And then they would have them, just kind of studied, and they would have their interactions coded. And again, they didn't really have any theories at first. They just wanted to see, is there anything potentially in terms of patterns that we might observe? And then they started following these couples, every year, every 3 years. And what they were able to start doing was to notice certain patterns, again, facial expressions, physiological measures like the EKG, or they invented this, thing called the jiggleometer, where they would have like a sensor platform underneath the chair to measure how much a couple would move when they were talking. And then they would have this, let me show you this dial. Go back. This dial called the Levinson Gottman video recall rating dial. And after the couple would talk to each other, they would then ask them to go into a separate room and watch their own video recording. And as they're watching their interaction with their partner or spouse, to kind of move the dial left or right, positive to negative, to in real time recall their own emotional experience with each moment as the fight progressed. And so you could see, again, just their own subjective measures of their experience talking to their spouse in a positive or a negative way. And so again, they're just observing. They don't have any theories yet. They're just looking for any sort of patterns with these physiological and these subjective sort of self-measures. And because of this research, all of the findings, which I'll get into in a moment, we've also been able to integrate a lot of the key findings from the research over the years into our form of couples therapy to help couples. So now, I don't measure, blood or urine or some of the other things that they ended up measuring later in future studies. But in most couples therapy, a Gottman therapist will use something called a pulse oximeter to measure each person in the couple's heart rate and blood oxygen level, to keep monitoring that, because some really important findings came out of this research in terms of the physiology and what predicted later satisfaction or demise in couples. So again, they were just observing, no theories, just learning. And one thing that I really want you to know about this time, in the early 70s, 72 is when Gottman first started this research, late 70s, starting to work with Bob Levinson and really starting to observe some patterns. And, one part of their graduate research that was really hard to get through was that, most people laughed at the fact that they wanted to study relationships because, most couples therapy was really just, an opinion. Most people were guessing at what could possibly help couples, to be healthy or to make it through issues. And one of the most popular books at the time was by this Dr. George Bach, and it was called Creative Aggression. And it was the beginning of couples therapy, and it was really just his opinion that couples don't air their resentment enough, and that's actually what needs to happen in order for them to have a healthy relationship. And so they would bring like a rubber bat, and each person in the relationship would just hit each other and say what they're most resentful about. You don't help me around the house, whack, or you're not affectionate enough with me, whack. And so that was the state of couples therapy at the time. And as you can see, there was a dire need for some real research because most couples who walked into couples therapy, Gottman actually later found out in some of his subsequent studies, most couples who went to couples therapy were actually more likely to get divorced because of the ineffectiveness and really just, most couples therapists just really guessing at what they had been taught in graduate school, which had no basis in sort of research. And so a big reason for this research was because there was really an absence of it, but also even as a graduate student, Dr. Gottman was really challenged because there wasn't any reliable research that showed that we could even predict human behavior. I don't know if you've heard of the marshmallow experiment. There's a cute little boy here with a marshmallow in front of him. But there have been a lot of studies that tried, excuse me, let me go back to the presentation, that really tried to, what I do? Woo! Okay. Oops, I think I did something. Reset. Okay. Bear with me for just a second. Click. Okay, I'm not seeing. I don't know what I did. Pause. Okay, so I don't want to answer any questions. Click exit. Full screen. No, that's not it. Start new. No, I don't want this. Oops. 1 second. Let me go back here. Okay. So, I don't want to do that. Bear with me for just a second. I think I pushed the wrong button. Okay. Anyway, so I'll finish the slide while I'm trying to work this out. Most of the research showed that we were pretty bad at predicting human behavior. And so the prospect of predicting not just one person's behavior, but two people, say in a marriage, was laughable to most people in psychology research at the time. And so poor Dr. Gottman, he really struggled to convince anyone that he could in any way predict human behavior. So again, the first research was really just about observing, gathering lots of different sorts of data, and then trying to see if there were any patterns, and then trying to see if anything like, say, divorce or satisfaction in the subsequent longitudinal studies could be predicted. And what he found was that actually he could predict, not just with accuracy, but with pretty reliable accuracy too. So it was about 91% accuracy in terms of his ability to predict divorce, which was astounding. Okay, good. We've got we've got the slides back. So let me go back to the slide that we were at. So he got some funding, which was a big deal, and that allowed him to keep doing longitudinal studies of these couples, and then also to keep with Bob Levinson to continue to predict accurately in several different groups over a long period of time, repeating and repeating and repeating this study, that through measuring physiology, through watching their interactions and seeing how they rate each other, they could tell with 91% accuracy not just if people would get divorced, but when they would get divorced. Because we do tend to see two different waves of divorce. First, kind of 4 to 5 years, usually after meeting, and then another wave tends to happen 13 to 16 years after first meeting. So thankfully for us, to have really research-based couples therapy, we now really know what puts most couples at a disadvantage, but it's not dooming, but it really does make it much more difficult to make your relationship last if you have some of these behaviors and some of these physiological traits, like some of these disaster couples that they were able to predict would get divorced. And so some of the key findings from this initial wave of research was not necessarily trying to help or to change these couples, but to find some key patterns that predicted the divorce or the dissatisfaction, like staying together miserably. So for the couples, these are the main ones that you need to remember. For the couples where at least one person's heart really beat faster, they had a high pulse rate when they were talking about conflict. Their blood flowed faster. They, jiggled around more, and they sweated more, testing the endocrine glands on the palms and the soles of a person's feet. Those were some of the key indicators for for inevitable divorce as they followed these couples every 3 years. And their relationships, these were the couples where their relationships really went down in their subjective measures of satisfaction, and then again, whether or not they got divorced. So thankfully they got the funding. So again, they were able to take these results and then build upon them. And then when Dr. Gottman moved to Seattle for a job with the University of Washington, he was able to create what is now nicknamed the Love Lab, which took the research to the next level. And they started really studying not just couples having a conflict videotaped and then having their physiology measured. He really wanted to study couples across the entire lifespan, gay and lesbian couples from different racial and cultural backgrounds. He wanted a huge sample size, and he wanted all of these studies to be longitudinal and to follow couples, from the time of being newlyweds and new parents to empty nesters and retirees, second marriages. And so he wanted to study them more in their own environment. And so he created basically an apartment lab. And this, because the technology was rapidly evolving in a good way, they were able to bolt cameras to the apartment lab and have basically each camera tracking their movement. They would stay there, each couple, they'd volunteer, and then they would randomly, pick couples, to make it more scientific. And when they were staying there for 24 hours, it was meant to feel like a bed and breakfast. So they would, have this beautiful view of the water. They were told to bring their pets or their papers or work, food, cook, everything to basically try to make this B&B experience as close to home as possible. And except they had the cameras following them everywhere except for the bedroom and the bathroom. And they also had the couples wear a heart rate monitor. So, like an EKG with 2 measures of electrocardiogram. And then they also, whenever they'd go to urinate, they would take a urine specimen to measure their immune system and their endocrine system. You can measure things like, stress level based on that. And also, your immune system. And some of the other things that they would also measure would be their blood. So they would take occasional blood samples, again, to get a good picture of their immune system and their stress levels. And so got a lot of great information that expanded upon, the first kind of level of studies. And that first level of studies, went on for about 23 years. So this kind of overlapped with some of that research, but, they expanded to have the blood samples, the urine, still had the cameras kind of following them, but they really wanted to start coding, and they would have scientists in the other room coding their facial expressions, but also their language. So what are they saying to each other? How often are they talking to each other? Just really, again, what other data can we get about couples, and then be able to predict with even higher accuracy, like how satisfied or not they're going to be in this relationship. So again, in the hopes that maybe we can do something with this information. So the 2 types of information that really emerged were, and of course there's lots of couples in between, but there were, at least 20% of couples were termed master couples, where they stayed together long term and pretty much liked each other most of their time together. Of course, they fought, just like the disasters. That's often a myth that you need to not fight in order to be healthy, and that's actually not true. There are plenty of healthy, satisfied couples who aren't the best communicators, who still love each other, and for the most part feel pretty happy and positive about their relationship. And then these disaster couples that emerged, and again, I think he used that term because that's how he described himself, were couples who their satisfaction, really decreased over time, and they either divorced or they stayed together miserably. And so what we can learn from that, something other than the physiology that we know is really predictive of the heart beating faster when they have conflict and all of the other physiological data, is what's called a ratio. The number of positive interactions to the number of negative interactions really was helpful in this research to determining which couples stayed satisfied and stayed like the masters, and which ones ended up, not liking each other. So the conflict ratio to keep in mind was really important. These disaster couples, when they were arguing, they had about a 1-to-1 negative to positive interaction. And by positive, what I mean is, if you're just listening to someone, even if they're complaining or, they're mad at you, giving them the time of day and looking at them and nodding, not interrupting, or, something like, that's a good point. Those were kind of categorized as positive, even in the midst of interaction. Humor, affection, physical touch. I'm sorry, honey. Certain gestures were considered, positive kind of contributions to the interactions. And then negative interactions, obviously, are more like, interrupting someone, eye rolling, walking away from someone when they're trying to talk to you. There were a lot of kind of negative there was a higher ratio of negativity in general with the disaster couples. And with the master couples, even during conflict, this was a big finding. 5-to-1 was the ratio of positive to negative interactions, even when they were arguing, even when they were in conflict. And so even when things were tense, or somebody's mad at the other person, there was still a pretty high level of positive gestures, and not just, kind of sunshiny, you know, it wasn't fake. There was still negativity, because negativity was necessary to describe what you didn't like or what you wanted to change. But there was still an overwhelming sense of respect towards their partner, and a little bit of, kind of, again, nodding, giving them the time of day, that sort of, positive gestures, willingness to lean into the conflict, were still considered positive. And what was also really helpful about this research is that it helped us to understand that beyond just how people communicate, which tends to be the real strong emphasis from a lot of couples therapists, is, it's really, really important for attachment and for the longevity of relationship that a couple has emotional attachment. They can bear through a lot of conflict when they feel really attached. And what the Gottman research really speaks to is when they're just hanging out, these master couples who make it, especially during difficult times, they have a lot of positivity and bonding, and they really are just like good friends when they're hanging out. There's like a 20-to-1 positive to negative, whereas with a lot of the disaster couples, there's really more of an absence of positivity. It's more like they're coexisting or they're arguing. There's just not as much investment, I would call it, into their, just conversation, or what we call in Gottman method, turning towards sort of behaviors. And so, some other things to remember, were that the masters really just treated each other well. Yes, they would argue, they would still hurt each other, but they tried to demonstrate affection, interest in each other. And they also, when they had conflict, they were good at what's called repair, which is keeping things, calm, keeping things, even if they did get upset, from further escalating. They were really masters at saying things that would calm their partner, like, I'm sorry, you're right, that's a good point. No, I should probably think about that. Or, whoa, that was a little harsh. Can you say that again? They weren't necessarily the best communicators, but they were very emotionally intelligent. And so beyond these sort of magic ratios, what I want you to remember is that, they also found in the research that there were 4 types of behaviors that were more destructive and sabotaging than other behaviors that were negative. So, there are a lot of things that all of us can do because we're all in the same suit. Let's be honest, all of us can lose our stuff when we're really upset. But what really separated the masters from the disasters too was that they tended to avoid what were called the 4 horsemen behaviors that the disasters actually usually would let run rampant. And these 4 horsemen behaviors were criticism, basically implying that there's something wrong with your partner, something like you always, you never, making kind of global judgments against them, rather than just, kind of making a complaint without blame. Contempt was the single most corrosive and most likely to predict divorce, other than the flooding. And contempt is basically disrespect and superiority. So kind of a righteousness, name calling, insulting, really emotional, psychological abuse, putting someone down, implying that you're better than them, is the single best way to destroy a relationship. And so that was the biggest predictor of divorce. And then the other 2 horsemen, were defensiveness, which is, not hearing your partner's complaint and just kind of, defending yourself or counter criticizing or acting like a righteous martyr. I really tried. And then stonewalling is disengagement emotionally from conflict. So, just a way of not staying present when your partner has a complaint. Leaning in is critical for staying emotionally engaged and feeling like a relationship's worth it. Does this person love me enough to listen up when I'm angry, or listen when I'm disappointed, or when I would just have a preference and want something to be different? So these were also some new patterns of behavior that were identified first in the Gottman research that really helped us to kind of understand what was predictive of divorce. And then, on the flip side, these master couples, that 20-to-1 ratio that I mentioned earlier, they don't take their relationships for granted, and they keep investing in the foundation of friendship and staying good friends, which we'll do more in some of our later webinars. But it's something about continuing to know the other person, showing fondness and affection towards them, and then being there for them in really small ways every day, rather than resting on your laurels and starting to take each other for granted. So they're really able, if you stay really close, good friends, really able to keep that negativity that we see in the disasters from escalating. They also, a repair is really anything that keeps the negativity from escalating. So as soon as it starts to take a wrong turn and you say something that's hurtful, or you do any damage, these master couples really are very good at repairing and taking ownership of anything that they've done. They also, these master couples have a sense of we-ness rather than me-ness. There's like a sense of togetherness, and I'm not going to do something unless it's good for both of us, versus a more selfish sort of, I'm going to do what's best for me, and you can take care of yourself. That's more of a disaster sort of behavior that we found later. And a lot of this is very intuitive. I know you would probably guess a lot of this, but some of this was very surprising to a lot of people, especially since there were a lot of opinions and myths going around about what makes a relationship really work. So this ability for these master couples to really keep negativity from escalating, and also to really, keep really good friendship and really, strong emotional closeness, and keep any sort of damage from turning into a resentment, like addressing it quickly, was pretty new information. And I think what Gottman really was able to bring to our field that was just groundbreaking also was that he didn't just study couples and watch them fall apart, because he was making money doing that. He was making a lot of money just being a researcher and being able to predict divorce with accuracy. And thankfully, even though he could have just stayed a researcher, he married Julie Schwartz Gottman, another psychologist who became his wife. When he was in his 40s, she was in her 30s. They met in Seattle, and she really encouraged him to take his research and start applying this and create an actually research-based form of couples therapy, because majority of couples therapy out there is not in any way studied or researched. The way that the Gottman method has really created a new way for couples is to not just change patterns of communication, which is where a lot of couples therapy goes wrong, but to really begin making interventions to change some of these behaviors, and then studying them long term to see, does this therapy actually work? And Gottman method is really the single most effective at helping the widest variety of couples. It's the only form of research-based couples therapy that has studied a very wide array in terms of satisfaction level where couples begin. Most couples therapy that call themselves research-based really study a very small selection of barely dissatisfied couples, versus the thousands of couples that we've studied and then also intervened to help have been very, very dissatisfied, showing much higher levels of intensity, more likely to get divorced, we've studied couples where there's been physical abuse, substance abuse, mental illness, lots of other complicating factors that a lot of couples therapy hasn't looked at and typically refuses to help. So it's really, I think, been wonderful to have this amount of research available to us. And I'm so thankful that not only John researched this, but together he and Julie, created the Gottman Institute, and were able to begin creating and then studying for the last, 20, 25 years, a form of couples therapy that actually helps couples. And so I won't get into too much detail about the Gottman method today, but I do want you to know that a big form of, couples of our theoretical model for the Gottman method is called the sound relationship house theory. And if you're interested in learning more about that, obviously you can keep watching our webinars, but also if you're interested in reading, the sound relationship house is really fleshed out in one of John's most famous books, which is the 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. And that can be found, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookstores, also on Audible, which, in this day and age with everybody being so busy, I think that's probably the best way most people can get that information. And then also some exciting news is that the Gottman Institute has also released a podcast recently called Small Things Often that goes into, small sound bites, like 5 minutes of, all of the different key principles of a sound relationship house or a healthy relationship, helping you to become like the master couples that we've studied, or like the disaster couples who have changed their trajectories by, really working hard to eliminate the sabotaging behaviors and start really implementing more of these emotionally connecting, leaning in sort of behaviors that make a relationship really worth fighting for. So I know we're coming close to being out of time, and because of my newness at this, I did get started really late, so I apologize for that. But if you have questions at any later point in time, please email me. Obviously, I'm a couples therapist. I am director of the couples counseling ATL, and we have lots of great therapists as well. But if you have ideas for any future webinars, please feel free to send those our way as well. And I'd really like to see if there are any questions. So someone says, great job so far. And audio quality isn't great. Uh-oh. Sorry about that. Maybe this is better. I just now saw that. So let's stay tuned for any further questions, and maybe next time we can resolve these technology issues and make this a little bit better. Thanks so much, and I hope you have a great day. Here we go. Okay, thanks.